on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland.
8 minutes to 3. What do you think about today's 20-somethings using their superannuation to buy their first home? Should 30-somethings have access to super for mortgage repayments? Well, young people in Singapore can tap their retirement savings to buy property, and it's one factor contributing to a remarkable statistic that nearly 90% of people aged 25 to 34 in Singapore own their own home. In Australia, that figure has slipped from 60 to 45% over the past 40 years. So what else explains the Singapore situation, and are there lessons for local policy makers? Phil McGann is the Director of Claritude Financial Planning. Phil, Singapore, have you ever been?
I have indeed, quite a few times, Kat. And the interesting scenario that you put there is, and we can see the difference between obviously Singapore and Australia. I mean, Singapore's a very concentrated, small area. It's got a bigger population than Sydney on about 10% of the land. And yes, younger people in Singapore can tap into their super to actually, or what they term as super over there, to actually make a deposit on a house or a dwelling and to make repayments on that dwelling as well. So the model at face value sounds attractive, but would it really work here? And that's the issue.
The deposit and the repayments would go to the Housing Development Board. Is that
Correct.
effectively the government, Phil?
It is. So the Housing Development Board is an entity owned by the Singaporean government that was set up about 40 years ago. And they basically build most of the dwellings in Singapore. If you've been there, lots of high-rise apartments and the like. They build about 80% of the dwellings in Singapore, housing dwellings or apartments mostly, over the last 40 years or so. The big difference, I suppose, is the government of Singapore owns most of the land in Singapore. About 90% of the land is owned by the government. In Australia, the government, various levels, own some land here, but not all of it, like they do over in Singapore. So it's a big difference. And what happens with that Housing Development Board is they gift the land component of the construction to the individual who buys it from them. They pay for the construction costs. And that's something that some people have proposed that we could do in Australia. But the big issue is the government doesn't own all the land here. And so that's the big issue about where is all this unproductive land in the capital cities of Australia where all the infrastructure is. There's not a lot of it around. And yes, the government could compulsorily acquire land from private owners and the like, but it's a very expensive exercise to do that. So that's probably the biggest issue I see with this proposal, that you couldn't replicate what's worked very well in Singapore to the Australian context because it's not the same thing here.
A lot of young Australians complain that the houses are just completely unaffordable, and we've seen incredible rises in house prices in Australia in recent years, Phil. So in Singapore, if the government largely owns the housing stock, is there much price competition? Young people might own their homes, but are they paying a lot of money for them?
Well, not as in the same context as they do in Australia because of the different sort of scenario we have here. I really think the biggest issue that we have on the unaffordability aspect in the Australian context is the competition, if you'd like, or the conflicting issues in relation to the different tiers of government, local, state, federal, and who pays for infrastructure, who does the zoning, how does the taxation implications impact capital gains tax exemption for homes and assets tax exemption for principal place of residence in retirement, things of that nature. All of those are competing. You take that in Singapore, they've got one government. There's no levels of government there. There's one government. So it's a lot easier to sort of control the housing stock if you own most of the land and you've got one level of government to deal with. That's not what we have in Australia, so it's very difficult to replicate that here.
And when we're talking about the homes that are owned by young Singaporeans, the average Singaporean apartment is about 1,000 square feet, which is roughly half the size of an Australian home.
That's it. That's the issue. So, yes, Singapore is a very concentrated island and lots of apartments, very, very few houses that the average person can purchase. And would that fly in Australia in the context here? Yes, apartment dwelling is more common these days in Australia in the inner cities, but does everyone want a small one-bedroom apartment like you'd have in Singapore? No. Could you raise a family in one? Probably not, in the Australian context anyway. So it's different lifestyle again on what we're used to here. So again, the headline looks good, but is it really practical and doable here in the Australian context? I'd sort of argue there's more issues going on there. And if housing affordability was an easy solution, we would have found it by now. It's not. It's a very difficult thing to get right. And first-home buyers have, for a long time, been complaining about the price of housing. It has been ever thus. But is it more and more difficult now? Potentially. But it's one of those things that all levels of government need to sort of put their hand up and take some responsibility for as well.
There are calls, though, to replicate the Singapore model in Australia, this option outside private ownership and private rental markets. It hasn't been completely dismissed. Phil?
No, and I think it's definitely worthwhile proposing it and sort of putting it up there and getting people to sort of comment on it as we're doing today. So I think there's some parts of it sound reasonable, but it's really for mine, where is the land going to come from? Because you look around Brisbane as an example here, where is all this unproductive land that the state government or the local council, the Brisbane City Council owns, that they could then donate into the scheme, and then the purchasers using their super and to fund the construction. I just don't think it exists in the level that proposers of this idea have really worked through.
Phil McGann, financial planner with Claritude Financial Planning. Thank you very much. Helen of Toowoomba making a very astute comment about negative gearing and its consequences. Thank you. It is news time, 3:00.
On your radio and online.
At home or on the road.
This is ABC Radio.